Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. I am one of your two hosts, Cullen McFader, joined, as always, by Clark Coffey. How are you?
I am doing fantastic, man. We had thunderstorms here last night.
Oh, yes, yeah, which is a rare thing for
Which
you
is
guys,
extremely rare. I think this is the first time that it that it rained out here since maybe like January or February of this year. So,
Right.
like 8 months or so. And so I was out running around in the street, up and down the street in the rain last night.
Well, it rained here too, less exciting. But,
Yeah. Well, you guys get rain up there, so
Yeah.
but yes, it was wonderful to get a little bit of rain, and I miss weather, having grown up in the Midwest. Of course, I was used to seasons and big thunderstorms and even tornadoes, which are pretty scary. But ever since I've lived out here in Southern California for the past, whatever it's been, 15, 18 years, some odd in there, it's pretty much like 78 and sunny every day. So I miss seasons and I miss weather sometimes. So yeah.
Well, it's funny, yeah. It's we've had a bunch of tornado warnings this summer for some reason, weirdly enough. So
yeah.
But without further ado, not to hark on the weather for too long, today we are doing the 1986 classic. I would say it's a classic, The Fly.
The Fly.
By David Cronenberg.
That's right.
Which is, I really love this movie, and
That's right. It's your pick.
I assume you do. You own it, and
Yep, I like
you
this
seem
film
to enjoy
too.
it. Yeah.
This was a pivotal film of my childhood. I don't even know. I got so much into the weather and thunderstorms. I don't know if we even took note that this is episode 45. Not that it probably really matters, but just in case, it was important for you to know. But yeah, we could kind of dive in then on our kind of first experiences with the film. But yeah, this film came out when I was 10, and I did not go see it at the theater, but whatever it took, a year or 2 years for this thing to come out on cable TV. There's no question that's where I saw it. I saw it many times. The extraordinarily gruesome body horror, the practical effects, the vomiting on people's hands and legs and dissolving them, and all that amazing stuff, and teeth falling out and pulling fingernails off. I mean, come on, what, like 11 or 12-year-old boy's not going to love that,
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And I love science fiction and horror. And this is basically a combination of those two things. Of course, it's more. We'll get into that later. But, when I was 12, I didn't really see a love story, or, I really wasn't honing in on kind of the beauty and beast, kind of mythic qualities of the film, and wasn't really concerned too much about morality and science and, all aging even, because at 12, I didn't understand kind of now the things I understand about aging at 45. I didn't know that back then. My body was young and everything was intact. So that was even, that was kind of obscured to me as well. So for me at 12, it was just like, this is awesome. Look how gross this is. So, and I loved it. What about you?
No, I think it's great. Well, it's funny. I saw this for the first time. I was probably about 12, and I saw it at a film summer camp that I went to. We watched it there, and
Nice.
the reason was because we were talking about like Canadian film and stuff like that. And of course, David
Right.
Cronenberg's from Toronto.
Yep.
This movie's not like it's shot and set in Toronto, but it's not.
Is this the first
explicit.
Canadian directed film that we've covered in the podcast? I'm just trying to kind of remember.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is funny because we've done a whole bunch of the ones that kind of have related both geographically and kind of personally to your childhood.
Yeah.
My Own Private Idaho, which is Midwest and stuff like that, and you having grown up in just outside of St. Louis. So it's funny that we haven't. This is kind of, I guess, if anything, my response to that. Now we're doing Toronto
Nice.
cinema. So
There you go. Perfect.
But yeah, so I saw this then, and we were talking about how kind of like, again, it's one of those things that this movie feels very Toronto to me, even though, again, it's like you see the CN Tower a few times in the background and stuff like that, and there's, sights and stuff that I recognize, of course.
Yeah.
But also just the feeling of it, in a weird, hard to kind of describe way, just feels very Toronto. The city streets and the way that it's just, I guess, for lack of a better term, the aesthetic of it feels very, very 80s Toronto.
That's so interesting to me, because it's not something. I mean, obviously, I didn't grow up in Toronto, so as a child, that would have clearly not been something that spoke to me. But it definitely didn't seem like it was any place specific to me.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with so much of this film being interiors and
Yes. Yeah.
it's not a very epic film in the sense that you've got these big kind of sweeping landscapey exterior stuff going on. It's like very kind of intimate and contained and interiors. So that's interesting to me that to you this like really speaks Canadian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and it's funny because that was kind of the initial reason that we looked at the film at that film camp. We were looking at kind of the way that like cities can have effects on films, and you can kind of tell. I mean, like even though Toronto plays New York and plays so many different places so often because there's a ton of movies that are shot here, it very rarely is there a movie that's actually set,
Right.
or like takes place in Toronto. And I think that that's one of the things that you can kind of like when I'm watching this, like it's quite clear to me at least, and again perhaps because I grew up here, that like it's not New York, it's not supposed to be anywhere else. It's kind of living in this Toronto dome, which I think is kind of neat, for the amount of stuff that's shot in L.A. or even again the Midwest. We've done a few movies now that have kind of been
Right.
centered on the Midwest.
Rumblefish. Yep.
And to kind of see a film and watch something where it's like not only is it just a sight and seeing and things and going, oh, I recognize that, but kind of recognizing the character of like a city within a movie. And it's much more clear, I'd say, in other Cronenberg movies like Videodrome. Is like very explicitly set in Toronto, and they discuss it and stuff like that. It's in the context of the film, whereas this film is not so specific to Toronto that it's like it couldn't take place elsewhere or something like that.
Right.
But again, it still kind of is neat to see a city kind of inflict itself onto a film.
Yeah, especially when you're a kid and it's like you love film, like you loved film as a kid, and to get to see your hometown, a place that you recognize, a place that in a film is a really cool thing. I mean, on the rare occasions that happened to me when I was a kid, like I think like one of the National Lampoon movies took place briefly in St. Louis, and you can tell. And I think like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, they drive through St. Louis or something, or they're at Lambert Airport. Little pieces of moments where St. Louis would show up in a major motion picture, and I'd be like, whoa, or even Chicago, a place that I spent time in with my parents. We'd drive up there and take weekends and stuff on occasion. And Ferris Bueller, when it came out, I was like, "That's Chicago,"
Yeah.
So
it's kind of as a kid, it's neat. Yeah.
As a kid, it's neat. If you love film and you don't live in L.A., it's almost kind of makes it feel real to you. At least for me, it would be like, hey, like. Wow, it's that you actually like make movies maybe all over the place. Maybe I can do this. Kind of made it feel a little more real.
Well, exactly, and that was like a big thing about doing it at the film camp was like, oh, this is shot, and of course Cronenberg's from Toronto, Howard Shore's from Toronto. They went to the same high school. Lauren Michaels, SNL fame, also went to the same high school. But
wow, I didn't know that.
But yeah, so there's of course Lauren Michaels completely unrelated to this movie, but
no, but that's kind of wild that from the same high school. I mean, that's wow.
That high school has Drake went to that high school.
Oh my gosh!
But no, and aside from
there's just one high school where all Canadian famous people come from. Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah. But aside from the actual, the geographic location of the film, I also like, I really think that it's like in a very good way, like a really like gross movie. That the effects are incredible, and that really impacted me as a kid.
Sure.
And just I think we'll get into this later when we discuss kind of the direction of the cinematography, but for starters, it is very like it's not a very flashy movie. There's nothing crazy with the
outside
of
the effects.
Outside of the effects, there's not like the camera's not there's no elaborate oneers. There's some cool stuff they did, which you brought up because of the BTS that you saw with the like motion control and stuff like that. But it's a very, in terms of direction, it's very. I don't want to say standard because that almost sounds like it's a complaint. I think it's actually really, really well directed, but it's not flashy. Like it doesn't feel like Cronenberg's trying to prove anything, which is kind of relaxing sometimes in a strange way, where it's like, you can just watch a film and the director's really putting the importance on the subject matter of the film as opposed to trying to show off with crazy camera effects or anything like that. So
it's
I do really appreciate that about that
direct
film.
As opposed to kind of it's not a like a lyrical meandering direction.
Yes.
It's like a
Yeah, and
very
it's
kind of
super efficient. Super
efficient and direct. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also I watched this again, rewatched this about a month ago, I'd say,
Mm-hmm.
and that was what made me decide that I wanted to do it for the podcast, because I had rewatched it for the first time in a long time, and sort of thought like, this is actually a really neat movie. This is it's again, like I just said, it's really efficient. The way that the story is set up in the movie is kind of brilliant in my opinion, because of how simple it is, and you just have this situation where it's like one line in the script will describe motivations for characters in a
Mm-hmm.
very natural way, which I think is brilliant. And it doesn't waste time with anything, but it also doesn't
Oh my
feel
gosh, it
rushed. The
doesn't waste
pacing
time.
is like really, it's not like it's like boom, boom, boom. You're getting whiplash from how quickly the movie's moving, but it doesn't meander.
I mean,
It's
almost,
really
almost
efficient.
though. I missed one thing though. Can I take like a step back and this is just like a funny story. So, like I said, I saw the film when I was probably 11 or 12 years old, and I'd seen it who knows how many times because you know how they are on cable TV and stuff. They'll play it over and over and over and over, and I'm sure back then it was like we had even with cable you might have like 25 channels or something, and only one movie channel. So I probably saw the film a dozen times. But it stuck with me to the point where when I met my wife, we weren't married at the time, but we'd started dating, and I found out that she was scared terribly by horror films. I until she told me in no uncertain terms I better stop. I used to like run around the house and try to use like Jeff Goldblum's fly voice, and I would be like, "I'm Brundlefly."
So what you're saying is that it's a miracle that you're married now.
Well, it is definitely a miracle that I'm married, and especially married to such an amazing woman. Yes, that is true.
It's interesting. I would assume that she would also possibly like this because of her medical.
I can't
has she
get her.
seen it?
I couldn't get yet. So
Okay,
there's
so she
no
hasn't.
way that I could get her to see this. I think she
Interesting.
caught pieces of it when she was a kid before I ever met her.
Right.
But there's no way. Like it is way too like she is. I mean, this kind of body horror stuff.
That's
Like,
really interesting considering that she's
I know. Well, she
doctor and
cuts
surgeon
people.
and
Oh,
stuff,
yeah.
yeah.
She. Yeah. I mean, like actual real
gore.
gore, I guess, if you want
Yeah.
to call it that. I mean, actual real human anatomy exposed, of course, doesn't faze her at all. She actually finds it to be quite beautiful. I mean, this is what she does. She puts people back together. But the body horror in this film, no way, dude. Yeah, I don't think I could
Interesting.
ever get
Well,
her
you know
to
what?
watch this.
In the next time you guys are up here, or if I'm down there again,
Yeah.
I bet she'll do me the favor, and I'll say, I really want to show you a movie from Toronto. I really want. It
Let's
means
try
so much
it.
for you. Or means
She
so
won't
much
be
to
able
me.
to sleep for a month, man. But
There you
anyway,
go.
but that just goes to show like how much this film stuck with me because I probably hadn't seen it since I was 11. So flash forward, 25 years when I first meet her, and that was like one of my first ways to scare her was to be
That's
like,
funny.
Brundlefly. Okay,
That's really
anyway.
funny.
So
Yeah.
so you were talking before I before I went down that path about direction. We were talking about how simple and kind of direct. I mean, I have to even to speak to that a little bit. Watching it here last night in preparation for this podcast, I was actually almost kind of jarred by how abruptly we pop into the story. I mean,
Yeah.
like it's literally we like fade in, or I don't even think it's fade. I mean, we just like boom, we like jump into the story, and it's like we've got Gina Davis and Jeff
Goldblum's
Goldblum
talking, yeah.
just mid conversation, or like right there. It's like there's no establishing shot. We don't have exteriors. It's not like we're setting up who they are or where they're at or what's going on. It's just like boom, we're in a conversation. These two people. Right
Yeah, we've
off
got the
bat.
opening credits, which really set the tone musically. Again, Howard Shore does a really great job with the
Yeah,
very
and the title
again,
sequence is
the,
great.
The title sequence is
Simple,
a lot
but-
of booming music, but
Yeah.
but that music very rarely booms in the rest of the film. But it really sets the tone for this kind of like tragic, but also curious kind of. If you haven't listened to the score of this movie, I recommend it. It's a really, really fantastic score in terms of,
Well,
evoking the theme and the feeling of the film.
Yeah, this foreboding. And I got to say, too, it's the kind of, if you want to call it an effect, because it's barely even that, where we, we actually have it. I mean, I don't know exactly what they did. It almost kind of seems like we're looking at like an infrared or like a reverse kind of the all the people at this convention that we end up, starting the film into with Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum just talking, their characters talking. But it's almost like we kind of see the movement of all of these people as insects. I don't know.
Yeah,
If
it's like almost like, and it almost reminds me sort of like a fly vision in a way of just like this really simple.
But it's very simply done. It's just kind of like a false color, or kind of like, it almost, like I said, it almost kind of reminded me of like a night vision camera or like an infrared kind of, that's not what
Predator
they did.
view.
Yeah, not what they did, but it kind of sort of trying to describe it. But yeah, I mean, but like I said, I was almost kind of jarred, because in today's day and age, where film grammar has kind of, it's always evolving. And, I think if this film were to have been made today, and now maybe if Cronenberg made it, he still would make it this way today, but because he's pretty much does his own thing. But I imagine if, like many other directors who are working today, if they directed a film like this, I mean, we'd have some, we'd have almost like a teaser, right? Like a pre-credit action scene. We'd have some kind of, we'd have to have this elaborate kind of thing to set up who these characters are.
It's
and where
funny
they're
that you
at.
mentioned that, because so I just actually recently saw in theaters the James Wan horror film, the new one, Malignant.
Okay.
Which I thought
I've not seen
it's
yet.
very dumb, but it's honestly quite fun. It's
Okay.
actually
Hey,
quite
that's okay.
enjoyable.
Yeah.
But it opens on this pretty much completely unnecessary like kind of, again, like that action scene, almost like that there's this like breakout at this lab, and there's and I feel like if it was done today, this movie, it would start with, it would be like scientists experimenting on something, and it would break out and kill one of the scientists, and then they'd have to like,
well, you'd probably start with the baboon, I imagine. So
or the baboon, exactly.
I call this the James Bond open, because James Bond films have made this right. This is, you've got the like the teaser action sequence, and I totally imagine what we would have would be this like slow reveal of like the tripod, or the telepods, I mean, and we'd have the baboon in it, and we wouldn't quite know what's going on, but we'd see like, oh, there's this baboon that's going into a pod. What's this? And we'd have this kind of setup, and it would be like super dramatic, and like, all this kind of, and then we'd kind of be introduced to Goldblum's character, to Brundle. He'd be at his computer, and and then like the big thing would be right, the teaser,
and it would establish that maybe his like funding is getting, like, they're like, we're gonna cut your funding if you don't
all the stakes, and then boom, we have this like big reveal that the baboon's he's teleported inside out, and we'd have and then it would like cut to credits, or the opening title sequence or something. I mean,
but it doesn't do any of that.
No,
which is also funny, because when I was again, I really like that when I was doing Daylight again, and when I was writing it, a few of the earlier drafts of the script also had like this cold open, like this kind of big, like, scary, almost like horror sequence at the beginning that was unrelated to the rest of the film, but kind of set up like a few of the things. And I, wound up cutting it, because I realized, like, A, it's not necessary. It doesn't really, like, it sort of comes back, but it's not necessary. And B, I almost like starting the film as simply as possible, and almost giving people like a taste. Like, it's almost like you need, I heard a really good example of it, or a really good description of it, which is that you need a entry point into the fantastical. So you need to start in a place where people sitting in a theater or at home are in their world with this movie, which we are at the beginning. We're just with people. And then you need to build this thing, which I think is really a good way of like sucking people in, and getting people to buy the scientific elements of the film.
Well, it's certainly
even
confident.
but even just the the way that this movie establishes things like motive, and that they're driving, Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum are driving back to his lab after this party, like this, like 5 minutes into the movie. And he just has this kind of throwaway line about how like he feels sick in the car, and that he hates transportation, he hates vehicles and stuff like that. He always gets motion sickness. And it's like right there, you've just established, okay, that's why he built the telepods, because
that's why we all do,
like
right?
Such an efficient way of exactly, we all build teleportation.
I mean, it's like, hey, I get motion sickness, I'm going to invent teleportation. The necessity is the mother of invention, of course. But you're right.
I think it's like really, really
very
a
matter
great
of fact
way of like, and even that, like, you don't necessarily need to have him have a motivation for building these telepods, but it adds this level of depth. And I actually really only noticed it the second time that I was watching it, when I was like, oh, that's actually such a great just line to sneak in there, and kind of have like, we've just learned so much about this character instantly, that he doesn't like transit, so he doesn't like vehicles, he doesn't like moving, he gets motion sick, so that's why this is like a really personal thing for him, and it kind of just adds this layer of depth to
Well,
this project.
And Cronenberg lets you make that connection. So
Yes, exactly.
Because I think a lot of times the way this would have maybe been handled would have been like this, like, Gina Davis's character would have been like, oh, so that's why you developed your teleportation device, huh? Like there would like they would have like taken
There would have
that
been a
extra
line
step
afterwards,
that would have like made it just too much on the nose. It would have gone like that one last step where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that often happens, but it doesn't happen here.
No,
Yeah,
no,
so,
and I think it's like really, it's just to me that's for a movie that's so efficient, that's really a great prime example of how the story is told in this movie, where it's like it doesn't beat you over the head with anything, it doesn't beat you over the head with themes
except for gore.
Anything.
But beats you over the head with gore.
Yes, definitely.
I mean, another
gross
thing,
out incredible effects
gross
and
out
stuff
gore.
like that, yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I was surprised about, obviously when I was 11, 12, when I saw this film, this was not something that I noticed at all. I mean, obviously I'm focused on totally different things when I'm that age. But I was surprised at how, I guess, small, and I don't mean that in any kind of negative way, but how small the story felt, how few characters there are, how few locations there are, it's I think the budget was about $9 million, which definitely would have been a low budget film even then, especially for a science fiction film with a lot of special effects. So definitely,
And
I'm sure
good looking special effects
and
too.
yeah, we're gonna get to that. Yeah, trust me, we're going to talk about the special effects.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be like the entire episode.
Because as a huge fan of practical effects, myself, I mean, we are at the zenith of practical makeup effects in this film. They won an Academy Award. I think Cronenberg's only for special effects. Obviously, he didn't do the special effects, but I mean, the film won an Academy Award for special effects. But we're going to definitely get to that. But I was kind of surprised, and it kind of falls in line with like, the direct and kind of straightforward direction. It just feels, I mean, almost even claustrophobic. I mean, there's very little exterior. There's very few characters.
There's like 3 major locations.
And they're small. Every space is kind of tight and crowded and kind of, it just,
there's like 3 major locations and maybe 3 major players.
The plot's very simple. It's not like we have some big convoluted plot. We don't have like you had just mentioned a minute ago, probably if this film were made today, you'd have like, the whoever's funding this would be part of the picture, and there'd be some like outside organization putting pressure on him to get this done. But there's none of that. Like we don't have any. There's almost no outside world. There's like
which is also funny because the sequel, The Fly 2, which is directed by the visual effects guy,
which I have not seen,
Chris Wallace. That one gets into that. Like it's like the corporation that's funding his science project is like this big bad, thing that's like they're like, oh, we want the genetic. They kind of turn into like the Wayland Corp from the Alien movies.
From Aliens,
But this one, there's none of that, and the only real mentions of them is that they fund him and that they don't, like, it's kind of almost funny that it's almost like a subversion in the way that he sort of says like, yeah, they don't really care because I don't cost a lot of money.
He just says, he's like, I'm not the genius. I just ask somebody to build me like an atom demoleculite, whatever, he just makes up stuff, and I just get parts from all these other people who are geniuses and they don't know what I'm doing, and I put it together and I made this. It's kind of funny.
And the only other mention of the corporation in the movie is the fact that the party that they meet at right at the beginning is like that corporation's party, like they're having like a little exhibit.
So now that you said you mentioned the Aliens franchise, I just had a thought. Can you imagine for just one moment a crossover film between The Fly and Aliens franchise?
Or a Cronenberg alien movie.
or a Cronenberg alien movie. Exactly. But I was just imagining like what happens if you combine a xenomorph and a fly? What if you
Well, it's also, what's funny about this movie is that there's like, and I'm not, as and as we've kind of spoken about, I'm not a huge, like, I don't really go in for superhero movies or things like that a lot.
Yeah.
But I find that like a movie like this if you were to present like superhero films in this body horror kind of way, I feel like they'd be so much more interesting.
Whoa.
Like you could almost have a movie about this guy that like wants to turn himself into like like I'm the human fly, and it's like
Yeah,
this
yeah,
tragedy
yeah.
where, and so which is why I think that that's one of the things where it's you kind of look at it and you're like, there's so many interesting ways to go with movies, and it's kind of a shame that so many movies these days are just very, very
Well,
standard, for
none of
lack of
those
a better
movies
term.
can be R-rated, so that's right off the
Yes,
bat.
yeah.
That's the issue there. Disney and Marvel are never going to make an R-rated film because, of course, it limits your audience. That's never ever going to happen. So
With the
nobody
exception of like the Deadpool movies, but those are more comedies anyway. So
yeah, but you're never going to have like actual like body horror, like
Yes,
damage,
yeah.
trauma. Like people don't really get hurt. They don't.
It's
They kind
actually
of just vaporize or disappear. It's like very sanitized.
It's actually kind of interesting too that and I didn't even make this connection before I made that point, but that I don't know if you remember, I didn't see the movie, but in 2015 I think there was a Fantastic Four movie that came out.
I did not
and
see
it was
it.
directed by Josh Trank, who did Chronicle, which was like this kind of indie sort of found footage movie about these like kids that get superhero powers and then things go wrong, and it's almost like a metaphor for like school shootings is like the allegory of it.
Oh, interesting.
And so then he wound up doing this Fantastic Four movie, and it's kind of one of the famous recent examples of like horrible studio interference, where like the studio interference was so bad that the director Josh Trank was like showing up drunk on set every day because it was like such a horrible experience for him and stuff like that. So but the reason that the studio interference was so bad was actually because his initial pitch to do the movie was to make the Fantastic Four in a fly-like way. Like he actually cited the fly, and I just remember that as we in the past 2 seconds when we were talking
Yeah,
about this.
yeah.
But so which is interesting. And he was like, I really want to focus on like the body horror elements, because of course the Fantastic Four, if you don't know, their whole thing was that like they get like radiation, as I think most superhero origin
All of them,
stories
right?
are.
You get bit by a
But
spider.
like it's like they get like radiation from the sun, and then suddenly
Yeah.
they start. The one guy turns into the rocks, and the other into the fire, and so it's like all this stuff. And he was like, I want to make this movie about these like people that have that happen to them, where it's all about the body horror.
Yeah,
And
because that's
that
what it
would
really
be,
would be, right?
Yeah, because to me that would be really interesting. But the studio, of course, didn't want that.
Think
They
about
wanted
this for a second.
superheroes and stuff. So
If this were like realistic, like if it were actually real, right? Like if something you were irradiated or poisoned or something. I mean, obviously this
or
is
teleported with a fly.
teleported with a fly, and I mean, you woke up the next day and your body was like actually physically changing, morphing fast enough that it's like, I mean, it's already bad enough just the regular aging process, which obviously that's a theme in this film, and it's one that I recognize now at 45 that I never recognized when I was 12. But I mean, this film, I mean, I'm not kidding. Like I watched this film, and it is like so visceral, this feeling of like his teeth falling out, his fingernails falling out. Now obviously I've not had that happen to me, although I have had a few root canals and crowns, so I close on the teeth thing, close on the teeth thing. But I mean, it like life is, I mean, there is kind of a feeling like that. You like look in the mirror, and every day you are watching your body disintegrate slowly. Like it is falling apart. Your body is literally falling apart, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's just the regular aging process. Now, if you actually happen to be unfortunate enough to get a disease or disorder or are disfigured just through like trauma in life or whatever, I mean, it it's wow, man, so that already happens to everyone, to all of us. Now imagine if that happened to you over the span of like a night instead of 30 years. I mean, none of these films actually grapple with the reality of that, except for this one.
And that's exactly what I mean, is that it's like it's a shame that studios are so dead set on this, because I genuinely think that if you made a movie like that, I think that it would do really well at the box office, specifically because people would be like, holy crap, I've never seen anything like this. I've never, or even if it's never, not completely entirely original, in the very least, it's like, this is so refreshing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it shows that a lot of movies that have a lot of, craft put into them that are well made and are different enough, they do tend to honestly do quite well. Usually, if they're good, they
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting Yeah, it's an interesting concept, and I think too, just to bring it a little bit back more to the fly here, it's like it's funny. You think about, like, for most of us, not all of us, but most of us, the disconnect between our minds and our bodies is pretty profound. We don't know what's going on inside of our own bodies. Like, we have no awareness of, like, the internal movements and mechanizations inside our
Mm-hmm.
body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and we're underneath our skin, most of us are terrified to see our bodies or
Mm-hmm.
experience our bodies, right? I mean, if you're seeing your bones or your muscles or your fat or, like, some other part of your body, like, something's gone wrong,
Yeah.
like, that is
Yeah.
not a good thing. And it's so weird that we're like, it's this whole mind body duality kind of thing, but we're like these just walking meat bags full of, like, flesh that grosses us out. It's our own body.
Yeah, and that just completely self-regulates itself, and
it's
sometimes that goes wrong, and
well,
sometimes,
always it goes wrong
yeah,
eventually. I mean,
yeah. Oh,
all of our
yes, yeah.
bodies go wrong eventually. Or, I guess I don't know if you call it go wrong because it's just the way of nature. But I mean, so it's just, I think this idea of, like, our bodies being alien even to us
Mm-hmm.
is I think it's so interesting to watch Brundle go through that experience here in this film, as his body. I mean, that's the thing that stood out. One of the things that stood out the most to me was, and this is, my own kind of personal, I'm obviously my own kind of attachment to it, but that's where I kind of related to it the most, I think, was this feeling of, like, my body is, like, alien even to myself, even though it
Yes.
is me.
Yeah.
But is it me? And we don't know. We don't even, the whole mind body duality kind of thing, and where the seat of our consciousness is, and all this kind of stuff. They're interesting questions, but it's like our own bodies are freaking alien to us, and they will get more alien to you as you age, and they will betray you ultimately in the end. I think is a really interesting thing to explore, and I think this
Yeah, and
film
almost
does
an
it really
overarching
well.
theme
And
of
the
it. Yeah.
desperation of Brundle, he feels his humanity obviously escaping, and his desperation to try to. I mean, he even says, I help me become more human, or human
Mm-hmm.
again, to the point where he's willing to put, this woman that he loves, her life in what will almost certainly be grave danger, because we've already seen how crazy things happen with the telepod. So,
Well,
you
I mean,
know,
that's what I think is a really, even just the kind of metaphor in this film for, like, disease as well, which is this personality changing element of it, where, because I
oh yeah,
remember when
yeah,
I was a
yeah,
kid, and my grandmother had, can't remember what type of cancer she had, but she was on, like, a lot of medication for it before she
like
died.
chemotherapy, and yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it completely, they don't remember people around them, and their
Mm.
personality completely changes. And it's like the same thing with something like Alzheimer's or
Mm-hmm.
dementia
Yep.
or something like that, where it's like your
Yes.
personality, and that, I think, is like one of the really frightening parts of this movie, is just how you can see, and I think Gina Davis especially does a brilliant job with the reactions to it, where it's like
Yeah.
this desperation to just, like, want to talk to the person that they used to be, and knowing that that person's never coming back. And you can see
Yeah.
that like every single time she visits him after the accident, and he's getting worse and worse and worse, and then you finally meet this person who's no longer in any way
Yeah. By
what he
the end.
was.
Yeah.
And even when he's, like, talking to her, I think it's one of the last times she's there, where she's trying to tell him that she wants to get the abortion, and he does this whole, like, kind of little mini monologue about, like, insect politics, and how it's like insects are
Oh,
brutal and ruthless, and he's like, if you don't leave,
I will hurt
I
you.
might hurt you, because
Yeah.
he's losing control.
Yeah.
And so it's this really, really, tragic, like, it actually is kind of heart-wrenching, on top of, and I think that's the thing, is, like, I don't think this movie would be made today by a major studio. And I think if this movie was made today, it would probably be a smaller studio, and they would probably focus entirely on, like, the gross out hot body horror stuff, and
Mm.
throw out all the emotional elements of it. And it
And
would
the
just
love
be
story.
it would be
I
like a
mean,
human
we've
centipede,
not
right?
even
Like, it
talked.
would be,
Yeah.
yeah, like, it
Yeah,
would
I
just be
agree.
this, like, this, oh, he's turning into the monster, and he's going to rip people apart and kill them. Whereas I
Yeah.
think what makes this film so tragic is that it really is, and it really does, I don't know, intentionally or not, harken back to kind of like the Universal monster movie thing, or like King Kong, where it's still this, like, tragic Beauty and the Beast kind of love
Very much.
story, like you mentioned, where it's, there's at the end of the day, you still, even when he is completely transformed and melded with the pod at the end because of his attempt to fuse himself with Gina Davis goes wrong, and he crawls out and he puts the gun to his head that she's holding. It's still like you're still sitting there feeling so much sympathy for
Big time.
this character. It's like, oh my god. And
Yeah.
I think what's amazing is that the film's runtime is only it's only what, about an hour and a half,
Yeah.
it's 96 minutes, and I think that works really in its favor, not because it's quick, and again, it never feels like it's rushing, but I think the fact is, like, by the end of the movie, when he comes out of that pod and he puts the gun to his head, and the film, like, of course, spoilers, but she shoots him, and you're sitting there and you're like, holy crap, this just happened in like an hour.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's what's really remarkable, is that you feel the speed at which this transformation took place.
That's what focus gives. We were talking. I mean, that's another word. We used words like simple or direct or small or intimate, but focused is maybe even the best word to use. The story is focused.
Yeah.
It's efficient and it's focused, and it's not worried about the scientific politics of like how he's funded and how da 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 like. Like trying to worry about explaining the science of it too much or all this other crap that a lot of other movies would put in. It's extremely focused. It's focused on, for the most part, it's this trifecta of characters, which is this love triangle. And you've got this really beautiful thing that happens here, which is not utilized very often in films, where we have kind of love triangle. We have Seth Brundle is the protagonist in the beginning, and we have I'm gonna forget. It's John Getz's character, and I'm blanking on his name, but John Getz's character,
Stathis, yeah,
that's right, is kind of set up as the antagonist, with this woman in the middle, who is and it's like he's
kind of like their dirtbag boss.
Yeah, he's rude to her, and he's cheesy and kind of misogynistic even, and like, hey, let's like get it on, even though we're not, he's like this, almost like this 80s kind of corporate, slime ball
Reminds
guy.
me a lot of the guy from Ghostbusters. What's his name? The guy with the beard from Ghostbusters.
I can't think of him, but he almost, or maybe like one of the guys from RoboCop. We did that.
Yes,
movie, one of the
corporations.
One of the boardroom
a very
guys.
very 80s cliche.
Yeah. And so we've got this kind of set up, but over the course of the film, and it's more complicated than this, because I don't think it's not just that Brundle becomes the antagonist, although in many ways he does, obviously, but we have Getz' character actually redeems himself. He actually rises to the occasion. He actually turns from this like sleazy kind of antagonistic guy who's like pitching fits about being left by Gina Davis, and it's clear that he deserved it. I mean, because they're representing him as this like not a nice guy at all, and won't let her move on with her life after she's decided, I don't want to be in this relationship, and he keeps trying to push it. He actually sacrifices his hand, his foot, and he saves her life. And it's just, we almost have this really interesting reversal.
Well,
now,
what's interesting too about that is that I find like perhaps the most intriguing element of it is that it's not even like, it's still, there's like a lot of like blurred morality there too, where
For
it's
sure.
like his motivation going in isn't super altruistic, but at least in my reading of it, it almost seems like he's just going in to kill Seth. Like, he comes in with a shotgun and is like, it's almost this still taking this character who is like you said, misogynistic, and he's sort of like going in and being like, I'm going to kill the thing that just stole my, like, the girl that belongs to me.
Yeah.
And so you get this element that it's like, he comes in and of course, as you said, he loses his hand and his foot, and then you realize, you're like, oh my God, this is like, I think it's a really brilliant choice on the part of Cronenberg's, because you kind of take almost a double take, and you're like, hang on, am I feeling bad for the guy who spent this entire movie trying to like sleep with Gina Davis and saying
you
like
definitely
inappropriate
are
comments?
feeling bad for
And
him,
you're
because
sitting there and you're like, oh my God, yeah, and suddenly you realize like this is how bad Seth has gotten. And that's not even Seth anymore.
Can I just
Brundlefly
say
at
that
this
it's
point.
like one of the grossest? It's like a pair of the grossest scenes in almost any movie, when he, because they've set this up right. You've got in the beginning of the film, or in the beginning of Brundle's transformation into Brundlefly, you see him regurgitate onto a donut
Yeah.
And we all know this too. Like it's like every kid learns that like flies vomit on their food to digest it, and you know, and we all know it's gross, and that's why when flies land on your food, you're grossed out because you know what they're doing. It's
Yeah.
disgusting. So we all have kind of this aversion to that already. We know that's like diseases are spread by flies and right? Nobody likes flies. But you've got this set up where it's like we show him regurgitating on a donut, and then he even makes this video where he's like documenting. Now this is I don't want to get too off sidetrack here, but we actually have kind of interesting thing where this was in the beginning where people were kind of, you know, camcorders were consumer, you know, video machines were available. People started recording their daily lives, their family events. This is interesting because this film is kind of at the beginning of that. So he's kind of making his own documentary, right? And he's describing how during his change, he now cannot consume food by eating it. He has to regurgitate on it and then eat it after it's been digested.
Suck it up like a straw. Yeah.
So it's this whole long setup. I mean, it's this long, like movie long setup. And then at the end, you've got him regurgitating on his hand and his foot. And it's like, oh, I mean, like it gets me viscerally to this.
Oh, it's
like,
really, and it's like the foot's like it's like acid and it's melting. Yeah.
And
it's that
like,
bit and the fingernails that really get me in the movie.
I can't watch the fingernails.
I always squirm. I can't. Yeah. But it's the effects again. Like when I say that these effects are, the reason they're so visceral is because they look so real, and for a movie that was made on this budget, this $9 million budget. Like even back in '86, it's incredible that you know this is
it's a man
to
in a
compare
rubber
it.
suit.
Like this is a movie that came out a year after Back to the Future.
Yeah,
right. So it's not like '86 is that long ago in the grand scheme of things.
Well, but it is pre CGI, obviously.
Yes,
obviously, it's about a decade before CGI would start to be or in
Jurassic Park '93 kind of brought.
Yeah. But I just want to say to this day, and like I get on a soapbox here for just a second, but I watch this film and you've got a man in a rubber suit, and that's basically what it is. Now it's like 7 stages. I think they only used 6 of extraordinarily complex man in a rubber suit stages, and I mean, but I still think this looks better, and the performance is more moving and captivating and emotive, with Goldblum, a good actor, actually there, and Gina Davis actually looking at this actor who's made up in this suit, and there's like a real response to real things that are really there, is so much better than the green blue screen, acting to a tennis ball CGI crap that we get nowadays. I feel like this is head and shoulders above that, and this is, how 35 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's what the shame is, that there's so many movies like that deal with body horror in this way, like The Thing, and
another classic.
And every single time that they've tried to either do like a sequel or a remake or anything like that, even the Alien movies, the new Alien movies where they're all CG and stuff like that, there's something so. Again, I don't think you can ever replicate, like you can get the most incredible skilled technicians on a computer to write the most incredible algorithms that disperse the light the way that real stuff would disperse the light. But I think you're still missing a part of it, which is the actors and their performances, and just the fact that I also always think it's always, I can never stand the idea of people just saying, well, CG is easier, because so what if it is? You're not making movies, like you're supposed to be having fun making movies. Why are you?
Right.
It's like when I'm on set, I want to have a big fly puppet covered in slime and stuff like that. Like that to me is what filmmaking is, not being like, well, in post we're gonna CG this thing in because it's easier. It's like, who cares?
Yeah.
It might be easier, but is it as fun? Is it as creative? Is it as engaging or challenging? No, it's that's to me is what filmmaking is about. And I think Cronenberg especially has. You watch so many of his movies, even his earlier films that are even lesser budget, that have, none of the really, like this was, of course, distributed by 20th Century Fox and produced by Brooks Films, Mel Brooks' company, which is the same company that did the Elephant Man, which we did a few episodes ago.
Right.
his earlier movies where he has similar effects,
Like Scanners,
and
the head
scanners,
explosions,
yeah,
awesome.
exactly, or some of the really neat effects with the TV in Videodrome and
Yeah.
the like the stomach stuff and that. And it's I think that you have a director, David Cronenberg, who really just likes that stuff, and I think that's why it looks so good, because it's not a tool or a task for him where he's like, oh, I've got to make this look good because otherwise the audience isn't going to like it. I think part of his joy is making it look good, so he's like, yeah, I'm going to spend as much time as I can on making this look really incredible, and it serves the movie so unbelievably well. And again, like this, if it's suddenly halfway through the transformation, it's like, okay, you've got makeup, 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 which is probably how they do it today, and then suddenly it would switch to a CG
Right.
thing. Like there would be a point where it would switch over.
You'd have a replacement. Yeah.
That to me would, again, you would feel it. You would get the feeling that, okay, now Gina Davis is looking at a tennis ball on like a stick. Like, you would just suddenly have this feeling of, okay, that's no longer. You know what? I've always
Yeah.
also sort of said this, and though I think the reason that Jaws, despite the fact that the shark doesn't look very realistic, or the fact that practical effects, you can often tell that they are practical effects. I think one of the reason that actually works in favor for movies, and works so viscerally, and why Jaws still works so well, and why this works really well, is because despite the fact that you can tell that it's a puppet or it's an animatronic or it's whatever, that's part of it. It's uncanny, and I think that that's what makes it scary. I think the
Hmm.
reason that the shark in Jaws is scary is not because because it looks like a real shark, but rather quite the opposite, that it doesn't look like something out of nature. It looks like a monster.
But
Same
it's
with this.
there though. But you can
And
tell it's there
exactly,
in
and
the
it's
environment.
there,
Yeah.
and whereas if you look at like a modern shark movie or a movie that has effects like this that are all done by CG, their focus is on doing it as realistically as possible. So a
Yeah.
new shark movie, they would make a great white shark look photorealistic, and it's like, well, that's not scary because, or it's less scary because that's just something that you could see out in nature. It's
Yeah.
no longer a monster; it's just an animal. Whereas when you have things like this that are still, there's that uncanniness about them where it's like it looks real and fake at the same time. It's incredible
Hmm.
makeup skills. I feel like that to me is one of the things that makes these things so unsettling, is that you
Yeah.
can't quite tell, like, oh, that looks so organic, but it's also, it moves in a way that feels really, really
Interesting.
disgusting and uncanny. And I think that that's one of the, almost the strong points of, the quote unquote weakness of practical effects, which is that, like, oh, it looks like rubber or whatever. I think that that honestly serves the effect in the end because it makes it uncanny.
That's
Um,
interesting. I mean, I think that the makeup and this, this Brundlefly effects and the suits and everything. I mean, obviously I know that they're rubber, but
mhm,
I really
mhm.
don't think that they look. I mean, it really and truly
Oh
looks
yeah, they're
amazing.
incredibly convincing in this movie. Yeah.
Every phase looks so good. Now, obviously, it's like I know that it's not real,
Mhm.
but there is something different about my ability to suspend disbelief and be affected by, let's say, the effects in this film, which are real. They're there. They're on camera. I mean, it's even though it's a rubber suit. I mean, it's real. It's a real person, and there's
Mhm.
real things happening. It just seems to me that I am more able to suspend kind of my disbelief and settle into the story and be there than if it were like an animated object,
Mhm.
right? Than
Mhm.
if I'm not sure why that is exactly.
And there's movies that use CG very well. There's movies that have blended those two.
Like
Again, Jurassic
Fincher
Park.
uses CGI quite well
Yeah,
because he uses it to augment things very subtly.
yeah, and again, Jurassic Park, which would have come out 7 years after this, which kind of ushered in. It wasn't the first movie to use major CG effects. James Cameron had used them in some of his movies in the '80s, but I think that the like, you look at a movie like that where it's like, okay, you've got practical, real. I mean, compare the first Jurassic Park to a movie like the new Jurassic Parks or something like that, where all the dinosaurs are CG, or even if they are practical dinosaurs, they're all enhanced by
Hmm.
computer effects or something like that, and they feel way less real. Whereas I think the fact that the CG was used sparingly, or only really used in instances where you couldn't have used anything else,
Like the
um,
full
the
body
full bodied,
dinosaur
huge,
shots. Yeah.
50-foot tall, whatever.
Right.
That to me is where CG. Like, I'm not a completely anti CG person. I think that there's, as with anything, there's uses for every tool.
Yeah.
However, in a movie like this, I think that had they gone the easy route, which, I mean, if it was made today, the easy route would be, of course, CG. Um, as you said, I think it would lose the visceralness. It would lose the texture, and the performances would suffer for it. And
Yeah.
I think the fact that it's actually Jeff Goldblum, like, I think that the discomfort he probably felt getting in that makeup
Yeah.
adds so much. And I'm sure you've got the experience as well, and I've got this experience, is that when I would do, theater or even some film stuff where it was like the costume was really uncomfortable, or like I remember one time I was just playing this old man, and I like put cotton balls in my mouth,
Hmm.
and I had this like really like uncomfortable costume on and this wig, and that to me made my performance so much better because I was able to use that discomfort in the performance and sort of hobble in and feel like I was an old man whose back ached and who
Yeah.
couldn't speak
Well, for
properly
sure.
because I had
I
cotton
mean,
in my mouth. And
yeah,
I feel like Jeff Goldblum's performance really, plays off of that.
I've even had like a lot of like makeup and special effects stuff, and I had a whole thing where I had like a false eye that popped out of my head in a film that I did, and had like these boils on my body that I like had to cut off, and it was like totally body humor, body horror, and it
Yeah,
also could be
depending on who
funny.
you're talking to.
Depends on who you're talking to. But, just like this oozy, wet, fleshy,
Yeah.
like body horror kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, to have that stuff actually there makes all the difference in the world from an actor's performance, because it's like, you can see it, you can touch it. It's real. And, even though it's like makeup, it's like it's such a small step for your mind to be like, this is real, right? Just like you were saying, it's like, even if you're an actor and you put on a costume, like, it's not your clothes, but the jump to make that your clothes is such a small one, but it's just a much bigger divide to be like, this tennis ball is a dragon or something, you can do it.
Yeah.
I mean, the imagination can do all kinds of things, and there are people out there who are quite skilled at green screen acting, but I just think that, in the grand scheme of things, it seems to me
Yeah.
that practical effects seem to, maybe it's just personal, I just prefer them, and maybe that's because I grew up with them. It'll be exciting to see where CGI goes. Obviously, it's a work in progress, and they're going to continue to refine that, and who knows where that's going to lead. We're
And
still
there's some
kind of,
really exciting stuff with like the augmented reality that they're doing now with the LED screens, and I think that's really neat.
Right.
But I think that the reason that's neat is because it's kind of bringing it back to the classic element of like actors being able to see where they are, what they're acting against, and stuff like that. I think that's what works for that. And you've almost also seen kind of a renaissance of practical effects lately as well, that like a lot of the new, for better or for worse, the new Star Wars movies have used a lot of practical effects.
Yeah.
And some of the like big blockbusters have kind of brought that back, which is nice to see. I mean, and it's not to say too, like this movie, I'm sure that, because they have that rotating set so that, Brundle can climb on the walls.
That's
and
right,
stuff.
the rotisserie for when he can,
So at the end, there's a bit when he's on the roof or the ceiling, and Gina Davis is like talking to him. Of course, that's two different sets. She's standing on the one that's upright, and he's upside down. So it's not like they shot those where she's actually looking at him. So there's always going to be a level of suspension of disbelief for the actors to be able to go.
of course,
Like it's not like it's not like when they shot that you had Jeff Goldblum on the roof when you were shooting Her single.
Well, this even happens. This happens all the time, even when you're not. I mean, it's like a lot of times, depending on where you're shooting. I mean, you shoot somebody's close-ups, and then you switch to the other side. And if let's say like you're a five-line co-star on a TV show, and the other person is the star of the show, you may not even. They may just walk off the set, and you've got to like do your lines to the PA or something. I mean. This happens all the time,
But having the initial, even just the fact that Gina Davis knows what he was supposed to look like there, and can see that and can feel that, and
there's
knows
some great
that,
behind the scenes footage on the Blu-ray. Which,
yeah,
by the
I've got to
way,
check that out. Yeah,
I highly recommend. I mean, it's just a regular studio release. It's nothing fancy, but it has a wonderful commentary track by Cronenberg, and it also has a two. I think with all the little enhancements, it's almost like 2.5 hour long feature documentary film, which is fantastic. But I mean, it's got all these outtakes of her, pulling the jaw off. Near
that's
the
really
end when
neat.
she
Yeah,
pulls
that
his
scene
jaw
is
up.
gross too. Oh man.
I mean, it's like, I mean, she is genuinely genuinely freaked out. It's like it's like you are really. I mean, it's disgusting. But I just like as we wrap up here, we're talking about the practical effects. I do just want to say, where that final transformation, where Brundlefly is pulling Gina Davis into the pod, and it's this final like transformation, and there's this molting that occurs where the full-blown insect, who is no longer any humanity at all, emerges from within the shell of Brundlefly. Oh my gosh,
It's incredible. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it is the most I would have to say that even
The flesh is just like falling off of him. Yeah.
I think it even eclipses anything that's in The Thing, which I feel like is one of the absolute
Best,
pinnacles of practical physical effects and makeup. I think
I would agree. No, I think that the effects in this film actually do. I agree with you. I think that even the earlier stuff.
Yeah.
I think that the attention to detail on that, The Thing looks fantastic.
Yeah.
But I think The Thing, because it's so fantastical, still kind of there's levels where you're like, oh, okay, I can see how they did that.
Yeah.
This movie is such an incredible mix of effects. But again, even going with that, but like Gina Davis pulling off the thing, and she's actually pulling the jaw off. Like when we were shooting Daylight, which we discussed this in the last episode, there's the scene where we shot in the in like the cellar, and it was like dusty and dark and like dank, and it was just this, and our lead actress Rio, like we had to keep spraying like glycerin on her to get the sweat and stuff.
Yeah.
And by the end of the shoot, we didn't even need to, because it would be had this whole day in this like dusty dungeon essentially. And I think had we shot that on a soundstage or like built a set for that, it would have had a completely different effect. Whereas the fact that we were actually in these tunnels and the like real, this real cellar that was dusty and really not the cleanest, best place to be.
Yeah.
I think that added to so much of the feel and the texture of that scene.
Sure, no doubt. Yeah.
And so it's, again, I see that so much in this, where it's like the Gina Davis being able to pull the jaw off of Brundlefly. And it's this really that scene is so incredibly done.
Oh gosh!
And if you haven't seen this, I know we've kind of spoiled the movie, but if you haven't seen it,
I mean, it's ridiculous. If you're listening to this,
yeah.
If you're listening to this and you've made it to minute 58 and you haven't seen this film from 1986, what in the world are you doing? I mean, look, we
I guess
appreciate you.
Well, maybe they'd really like to hear us talk.
maybe, and don't get me wrong, we appreciate you, but yeah, go see the film. It is absolutely, I think, not only is it a great story, and we have focused a lot on the practical effects because obviously that's one of the things that really stands out from the film, and it's fun to talk about it. But there is a lot more to this film than that. Great performances, great score,
a lot of subtlety in storytelling,
really interesting themes, and it's just, and it's fun to see a young Jeff Goldblum doing his kind of cool scientist thing before he really honed in on that in Jurassic Park, and that kind of became like his thing, for a while. And Gina Davis is fantastic as well. And this is before she went on to, I think, was it League of Their Own, and Thelma and Louise, and she became, a leading lady and a big actress in her own right too. So this is like a little earlier in both of their careers. But and hey, Canada, right? What more can you ask for in a film?
Yeah, exactly. Toronto.
Like, nothing else to add. All right, guys. Well,
yeah.
Well, Cullen, as always, man, it was a pleasure. This is like a fantastic choice. So great selection. It was a blast to watch this again and discuss it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic movie, yeah.
Yeah, and everybody else out there, we hope that you enjoyed our discussion of The Fly. Until next time, everybody, have a wonderful week.